welcome everybody. It's a sunny day here in Auckland for those of you in Asia or elsewhere around the world, and we're having a great summer down here in New Zealand. State of the New Zealand property market. What we're going to talk about today is three things, and firstly, the property bubble. Is it fact or fiction? Is it a property bubble? We've seen prices in Auckland go sideways, and we'll talk about that more. Is it about to pop? Where and what to buy for maximum pop capital growth, and how to make money out of property. We'll spend probably most of the time on section one, and as we go through, just jump in and type your questions, and we'll answer them as we go through and get some feedback as we go through. So, the property bubble, fact or fiction. If we go back for a minute and we look at what the property market has done since '92 up until the GFC, we can see that the market jumped up and then flattened off in leading up to the 2000s, and then took off again. And during that period, the boom before the GFC, I left corporate, I traded property, and then I had an accounting practice, and we were helping investors. And there was a lot of rhetoric around at the time that the market was about to crash, that it was overheated, that it couldn't be sustained, that prices were unaffordable, that it was just ridiculous, and that we were likely to see a drop of about 30% of values. And I guess this is the slide that I always started with, and I've been looking at this slide for 11, 15, 20 years now as a starting point. And why this slide captivated my attention, or our attention, was that for sure the boom in the early 2000s was massive. And if you look at that graph, it just looks completely out of whack to the rise in prices in '92 when we talk about dollar increases. But what we started to do was say, well, percentage-wise, actually, the boom before the GFC was not that much greater than the rise in the '90s, and that made us start to ask questions and say, well, is this market that we're in, bearing in mind going back before the GFC, is it really as overheated as people make out in New Zealand particularly? Now, we then encountered the biggest recession that we've seen in our lifetimes, and what happened is, yes, the market came off. At the time, there were a lot of people saying that the world was going to end, and that the sky was falling, and some days it kind of felt like that, because there was a meltdown for sure, and hundreds of thousands of redundancies in the US. But when you look back at it, you can see that actually it sort of looks like a blip rather than a catastrophe. And what's really interesting is we've since gone on and experienced another boom. And now we're hearing again, and have been hearing for some time, the press and other commentators saying that the market is overheated, it's going to pop, and it's not sustainable. Now, not for a minute do I suggest that rising property prices at the rate that we saw them rising 4 years ago are sustainable, and that we want that to go on forever, because it's not sustainable. But the question that captivates us, and that we are constantly asking ourselves, does it mean, because we've had significant price rises, does that mean that we have a bubble, and are we going to experience significant value decreases, or do we have an underlying platform of stability? And I suppose that's the question that we want to ask today. So let's have a look at what that could reflect. Now, this is the Auckland median house price graph, and you can see there's some volatility more recently as we've come off, and we'll talk about what's driven that. So the way that we like to look at it is demand versus supply, and go back to basics, and always keep it real, I guess, and look at the fundamentals and ask ourselves, how do the fundamentals sit against each other? Do we have more demand than we have supply? Because if that's the case, then we're unlikely to see significant price decreases, in our humble opinion. So what we're going to do in this section is, first of all, look at the demand drivers and consider where they sit and where they're going to be going, and then look at supply. So it's that balance of demand and supply, and that's what we encourage people to do when they say, what's the market going to do? Well, we really encourage people to take account of all the drivers. Okay, so let's jump into demand. So this is national sales volumes, and it's a reasonable measure of demand. And if we overlay that with population growth or population trends, we can see that, first of all, that the country's going to grow. So the population will grow, and it's been forecast to grow by Department of Stats. And look, there's some discussion at the moment around whether previous, some of the records to date have been accurate, but the reality is that we've still had growth. So if we overlay net migration across house sales volumes, so I'll just let you absorb that for a minute. So if we overlay net migration over house sales volumes, if you look back to the last couple of booms, not the one they've just been through, but back to 92, you can see there's a really close correlation. So population grows and house sales volumes take off, which is just common sense. It's just demand. People come to the country, population grows, they need somewhere to live. Net migration drops off and demand shrinks. And we've seen that historically for two cycles. Now what we've experienced is that population growth has grown at record levels, and even if you slice the top off that, is there perhaps a little bit of overstatement? Hey, we've still had some really significant growth. And what really interests us is that the net migration has spiked, but sales volumes have not kept pace. So how could it be possible that we have all these people coming into the country over the last few years since 2013, but we're not seeing the historical corresponding response with sales volumes? Well, quite simply, we just don't have the supply to be able to meet that demand. And I think there's general consensus that we have a housing shortage in New Zealand, and I guess you have to have your head in the sand if you're not hearing about the commentary around what's happening with Kiwi Build, etc. So that's the first really critical piece to take account of. Demand drivers. One of the most significant is population, so population growth. If we lose population, obviously demand is going to shrink. So what about interest rates? How do we think about interest rates? So again, the orange line is sales volumes, and we're looking to see what impact interest rates have on sales volumes. And this graph would suggest there's not a direct correlation. And so if you look back in the early 2000s, you can see the 2-year fixed rate slowly climbing, but sales volumes don't immediately drop off. I'd like to suggest it's one of those sort of secondary drivers. It's still a really critical driver, but it doesn't necessarily hit straight away. It's almost like a delayed impact where people keep buying because they don't want to miss out on capital growth, and they keep buying and they stretch themselves, and the bank will lend money, so they take on debt, and then slowly interest rates creep up on them, and they just gets a tipping point where it's no longer affordable, or people just can't afford to buy anymore. So interest rates are absolutely fundamental to demand, but it's not necessarily the impact is not necessarily immediate. What about affordability? So a lot of commentary often around affordability, that prices have become affordable and therefore prices have to drop because nobody can afford to pay for the houses anymore. And that's often one of the key arguments for suggesting that prices will drop. So let's look at the facts. So this measure of affordability is simply the median house price as a multiple of average income. So if we look at that and compare it across cities around the world, and you've got to think cities, you can see that Auckland is not out of whack with other cities. Okay, it's more about as unaffordable as Los Angeles. It's more affordable than Sydney and Melbourne. Well, it is today. If you believe the press that Sydney's prices are going to drop, maybe that'll change. It's more affordable than Vancouver and Hong Kong. And I guess you also need to look at the way this measure is calculated. It's made up of average incomes. We haven't seen a lot of wage growth over the last few years. So yes, prices have risen, but property prices have risen, but wages haven't. And then there's also the issue that we don't have a lot of density in Auckland. we're moving that way and greater density is coming. But when you calculate in a median house price, it's made up of lots of 3-bedroom standalone homes. And over time, as we get more and more terraced housing, then that will possibly, I guess, adjust that median house price relative to income. So I'm not convinced that property is really as unaffordable. Yes, there's a challenge for young people to get into houses, absolutely. But the affordability issue is, well, we see it time and again where people say, I'm going to have to shift further out, or I've got to look at apartment living. Normally, people might get married or get a partner and start living in a house on a section. And certainly when they start a family, but we're starting to see that even in our business, people coming to us, their first home is an investment property rather than a place where they're going to live, because they're happy to keep living in an apartment so they can live in a suburb that they enjoy. Not convinced that unaffordability erodes demand to the extent that some would suggest. Home ownership is going down. And it has been for some time. And you might say, well, would that not decrease demand? Well, in some ways, yes, but not overall, not for housing. So we still need housing. People have got to rent, so they've got to have housing. So it just means that investors have to play a bigger part of the house ownership profile. So just think about that, I guess, when a government might want to demonize landlords. Well, they actually really need them. So, yep, there needs to be protection of the tenant, and we need to treat tenants with fairness. But the government also needs to make sure that they don't kill off investors completely, because they actually really need them. So home ownership's going down, but again, I don't think that means that demand is going to be completely eroded, or it really overall impacts demand much at all. Confidence, hey, it's not bottom of the barrel, it's not low. Government hasn't probably, business isn't raving. The business community is not absolutely thrilled about what government is doing, but overall, I think the economy is reasonable, and consumer confidence not at all-time highs, but I don't know that it's terrible either. So I'm not seeing that as a demand, an overly negative impact on demand. Right, availability of credit, that's a big one. So we've got immigration, big one, and availability of credit is also really important. So let's get a pause there. I think we've got a question from somebody that Toby's got.
Yeah, hi Alan. Question here. So with the recently concluded Royal Commission in the banking sector in Australia, which will result in a tightening of the lending conditions there, and combined with a general downtrend in property prices in Australia, how do you see these factors affecting the New Zealand market going forward?
So thanks, Toby. So I'm going to get Lisa Phillips to contribute in a minute to this as well. The background to that is a couple of things around this. Is that, first of all, New Zealand banks are owned by Aussie banks largely, so there's been a lot of changes that the Aussie banks have been through. They've been wrapped over the knuckles by the Reserve Bank of Australia and told to tidy up their balance sheets a couple of years ago, and then the Aussie banks sucked back a whole lot of money from their little subsidiaries called New Zealand, and so New Zealand had to repatriate a whole lot of money, and that took adequate liquidity out of the New Zealand banking sector for investors. So that's had an impact, and we're starting to see that ease. But what I might do, Lisa, if you want to come in and have provide some comment around the banking report that's come out, and your thoughts around the impact on the property market here.
All right, thanks, Alan. Hi, everyone. Yeah, good question. I guess just a first point to make is just to put the report itself into a little bit of perspective. The Royal Commission remit ranges beyond the banks to sort of the wider financial services specific to Australia. So while 4 of our main banks have an Australian parent, this report is actually addressing a lot of wider issues that are not relevant to New Zealand. But having said that, there is some relationship, and we do need to have a think of what could happen. So I guess the logical impact would be that we would get tighter lending criteria. I guess the question for me is, what's the likelihood of that? So New Zealand ran its own report. We ran a report through the Financial Markets Authority here, which did find a number of weaknesses in the way banks govern and manage our conduct risks. So again, we were told to tidy up a few things, but I think what's most important in terms of difference is that compared to the Australian situation is that there was only a very small number of issues that were relating to poor conduct by bank staff. So this is where there's sort of a real difference, and what's being sort of labelled in Australia in terms of this is very cultural. It's not, doesn't apply to New Zealand, and I think that's been backed up by the New Zealand Banking Ombudsman, who says our banking is very well regulated and that we are not showing those same kinds of systemic issues. The second point to make is probably again to get a little bit of perspective around what has happened to the New Zealand banking environment in the last 3-4 years, where we have already had a big tightening in lending criteria, both with the LVR and serviceability. So to look at sort of loading more in that area when we look at what's happened to date, look, my view is that a little bit unlikely, but I guess it is a wait and see, and of course we can't dismiss the fact that we do have Australian parents, and that, you know, that could have some impact. But in terms of differences, we've got some quite big cultural differences. A lot of those things do not apply to New Zealand.
Thanks, Lisa. Just coming back to you on the poll that was being asked, what do we think about the impact of a capital gains tax? Most 30% saying they wouldn't stop them buying. Roughly 36% said no. Other way around, 30% said no, wouldn't stop them buying. 29% said yes, and the rest are unsure. Interesting. Capital gains tax will stop you buying, and I guess the question is why? Why would that stop you buying? Because why do you think that prices will go down? I'd love to have that conversation with you. Right. Carrying on about Aussie banks and capital adequacy. So, yeah, overall, we've also got behind that new Basel regulations and potentially need for greater capital adequacy. How will that flow through? Will that have a hit on interest rates and lift interest rates, and then will that discourage more borrowing? I'm unsure as to whether. Well, first of all, there's two things. Will it increase the cost base of banks if there's greater capital adequacy? So, some would argue yes, but others would argue, well, actually they've already got that kind of capital anyway. It's just a reclassification. I'm not an expert. But regardless, will banks use it as an opportunity to increase interest rates? Possibly. It's a competitive environment. Is it competitive? We've got to wait and see. What I would say on that is that I saw an interesting slide, some research that was done that went back to Egyptian times. It was done by the Kiwi Bank economist. So I'm not sure quite how he got interest rates from that far back. But anyway, take it for what you want. That historically, interest rates have averaged about 5%. And the only reason that they've ever spiked is because a couple of reasons. One of the main ones was when we had a massive baby boom after the war, and that resulted in interest rates spiking really significantly. And so it's closely tied to big population growth spikes. While the population is still growing at the moment, that population growth rate is slowing. So there's evidence out there to suggest actually we're not sure if we're ever going to see interest rates surge back up to that 10% level. And I'm sure, I've always been wrong about interest rates. I've always thought interest rates since the GFC are any time now going to spike back up. So, hey, who knows what's going to be happening? I could be wrong, but I think that's worth considering because, look, we have been in this low interest rate environment for a long time, and there's no real sign. We've seen what the Reserve Bank has done this week in keeping the OCR at 1.75%, I think it is. So not convinced that we're going to see interest rates spike up anytime soon. Righto. Probably the slide that a lot of people are interested in, which is talking about some of the prudential legislation changes. And I'm just going to put them all up and we'll just run through them because, okay, first of all, we've seen the LVR requirement reduced. So the Reserve Bank introduced a 40% deposit requirement for investors. That's now eased back to 30%. That sends a signal from the Reserve Bank that they're seeing the risk of the market being overheated easing. They're liking the fact that it's taken the heat out. I think the big thing to remember about this is that this has been in place for a couple of years now in some way, shape or form. So unlike the lead up to the GFC where people were just going gangbusters and could borrow as much as they want and borrow up to 80, 90%, and we even just before the GFC started to see liar loans coming into New Zealand where you could just state your income and make it up just about. That just started to show its face with some non-bank lenders. What's different about the environment at the moment and that leading up to this slowdown, we've had the Reserve Bank essentially forcing investors to have a buffer, so increasing the amount of equity that are in loans taken. So for loans that have been taken down by investors for the last few years, there's much greater levels of equity. So I think they've put some insurance in there, and so that's a healthy thing. So that on its own suggests to me that even if things get a bit tougher, investors as a whole are probably in a position where they can manage their servicing better. Bright line test, 5 years, but we'll come back to capital gains. That's where if you sell within 5 years, you've got to pay tax on the gain. Foreign buyer ban, people say, what's the impact of the foreign buyer ban? Is that, really hit the market in New Zealand? And my question is, well, what percentage of buyers do foreigners make up? And that's sort of usually a pause, and people go, "Oh well." And there's no absolute measure of in New Zealand of the percentage of foreign buyers. And I think it's pretty unfair to turn up to a sales auction room and measure foreign buyers by the colour of people's skin, because it's a pretty multicultural country, and the colour of your skin doesn't tell you whether or not you're a New Zealand resident or not. What I'm saying is that there's plenty of immigrants that have come to New Zealand who are New Zealanders that are buying property. So we think it's less than 5%, and that being the case, then it's not going to have a big impact, and we haven't seen it having a big impact. I think it's just a red herring. Borrowing cap, will there be a borrowing cap? Well, it's sort of been introduced already anyway, because the Reserve Bank, from what we understand, have said to the banks, if you don't sort of self-regulate how much you lend to people, we'll bring in some regulation and force you to do it. And is that part of the banks tightening up as well? Probably. And one of the articles I wrote and said, what's driving all of this? Is it Basel? Is it the Australian banks? Is it the borrowing cap? It's probably yes to all of them. The answer to why the banks tightened up on lending, it's probably yes to everything. And lastly, capital gains. So what's the impact? Will there be a capital gains tax? A few questions. Will there be a capital gains tax? Probably. How will it be introduced? What format will it take? Don't know. Will they grandfather it to properties bought before the introduction of the legislation? I doubt it very much. Will it be at 33% or 39% or some ridiculously high rate? And if they did that, it would be the highest in the developed world. I doubt it. Will the national government, if they get back in, reverse the legislation? What government in their right mind would ever reverse a revenue-taking mechanism? Of course they wouldn't. Will they be smart about how they do it? Possibly. Be less aggressive than Labor? Probably. And then the last question is, what impact will it have on property? Will it have on property prices? Australia introduced a capital gains tax in 1985, and Australian property prices have never gone up since. Of course they have. So a capital gains tax plus a stamp duty in Australia has had pretty much zero impact on property prices, and it certainly hasn't stopped them going up. So that's my view, and I just want to get Lisa's view on the impact of capital gains tax in New Zealand.
Thanks, Alan. I realise that there's probably a number of you listening that have got some expertise and working in the tax area with a little bit more sort of knowledge and opinion around some of the operations of this. But I think, look, it's fair from our perspective to acknowledge that it probably is necessary to bring some balance to parts of our tax system. What we understand so far is that the tax working group that's about to release their report may be sort of taking a blunt approach, and I think that the outcome of that is probably going to be what governs the impacts on the market. So until we have a little bit more detail on that, it's a little bit difficult to say, but I guess some of the things that we can consider would be that there would be a change in investment decisions and buying behaviour, could alter demand for bank lending, and also sort of I think the main thing is that if people do decide to hold on to property a lot longer as a result of the legislation, then that may change what kind of stock movements we have in the market, and that could lessen stock movements and increase demand. Just from my perspective, I guess some things to sort of look at that would need to be answered in terms of sort of before we could determine sort of impact is the tax-free threshold. You know, what years will the marginal tax rates apply? Selling at a loss, will they introduce tax credits again, as you brought up, Alan, the marginal tax rate? So I think there's lots of things that need to be answered before we could sort of provide a better sort of thought around it.
Yeah, the other issue is moving on from that a little bit. Not moving on for it, but is there a risk that Labor tries to shove this through and bring it into force before the end of their term? They'd be nuts to do so, because a capital gains tax will impact every aspect of the tax legislation, and there will be a massive outcry from the professional community against them doing that, because it would just be carnage. And so I doubt very much that the legislation will pass in to before they've had 12 to 18 months to work it through. That takes you into a new term. Now, who in National is going to see this government, see National come into power? Who is the leader that's going to do that? Is there a person in power? That's a whole other discussion. But the point being that, and that leads on to the question that somebody's just asked, surely National will campaign against the capital gains tax? I don't know that they will, because I don't know that there's enough sort of. I don't want a capital gains tax because it means I've got to pay tax, but it's been talked about for so long, and there is pressure from the global community and many other reserve banks for us to introduce a capital gains tax because of the impact on other economies, that I don't know that they would campaign against it, because they may not be onto a winner. I'm just not sure, and time will tell. So I'm not convinced. But overall, I stick back pragmatically and say, okay, let's again bring it back to basics and say, what impact will that have on demand? Will it mean that people stop needing housing? Well, no. We've still got all these people that need to have housing. So, and then eventually people can borrow more money, and then prices start to go up. If people see prices going up and they say, well, it means that I just lose 20% of my gain. So I am an absolute believer that capital gains tax will have zero impact on the property market in the medium to long term. So if you're going to quote me, don't cut that last piece off that says on the medium to long term. Yep, in the short term, people will stall and wonder what's going to happen. Ring fencing losses, possibly they'll do it. Who knows? I think before I go on, the picture that we have kind of evolved in our minds collectively around this is that you've almost got this billowy cloud of gas that's at the moment feeling a bit toxic. So we've got the capital gains tax, we've got the borrowing cap, we've got ring fencing losses, we've got the LVR restrictions, we've got the banks that are been quite restrictive on what they'll lend, and property's fallen out of favour. Got all those things going on, but I think of it, yes, they have an impact, but they are gaseous, and that eventually they will dissipate. For example, we're not talking about the inability to claim depreciation as a tax expense in your return. That was rolled out 10 years ago, or 8 years ago, and we've forgotten about it. So no longer, but at the time it was a real issue. I'm going, oh my goodness, what's going to happen to the property market? So people were really concerned about the impact on property prices as a result of investors fleeing the property sector, or people fleeing the property sector because of the inability to claim depreciation. But it's gone, it's dissipated, it's had an impact, it's a consideration, but it doesn't affect the fundamentals. So, and then I say, well, what are the fundamentals? The fundamentals are the key demand drivers of net migration and availability of credit. So I think that foundation is really, really strong. And you're going to say, what about availability of credit? We can't get credit. And I'm saying that that's actually to a degree artificial, because banks are surely one day going to turn around and go, actually, we can ease this. We can probably ease our lending criteria. And interestingly, there seems to be some easing of serviceability or lending criteria in England and India and one other nation, I think China. So that seems to be, and when that happens, you've got to remember that there is pent-up demand. So there's a need for housing, and there's people that, I mean, we're in this business, so we're seeing people all the time that would like to buy that are just restricted at the moment because they don't necessarily have, they did have serviceability under the old regime, but not so much now. If that eases, there'll be a whole bunch of people that'll go, yay, now I can start buying again. So I think we've got a really solid demand foundation. So the next question becomes, what about supply? Where does supply sit? And are we about to have a sudden flood of supply that will overwhelm the demand and mean that prices could drop? So demand is solid, and let's look at supply. Okay, I'm just going to pause because I think there may be another poll question that we're going to put up. So I'll let that go up, and we'll move on. So I'll let you look at that poll question, and I'm going to keep going with have a look at the supply. So supply, where are we at? This is just look at this visually, and this dotted line is the long-term average of supply, and it's just simply looking at the amount of houses on the market based on the time it takes to sell. And we can talk about that calculation method. It's not us that's doing it, it's realestate.co.nz. But the picture is look at what supply there is, which is the blue part, and how low it is compared to the historical average. So hang on a minute, we've seen this supports what I said right back at the beginning, looking at the net migration graph. It supports the assertion that house sales volumes have not kept up because we don't have the level of supply to meet demand. And we've got some specifics around the cities, so you can see that Waikato's 17, it's really low in areas. The flip side is that that consents issuance has gone up. So we've seen building consents growing and get into a level where potentially it could meet demand, but actually later on we'll see it won't. Remember that you can't live in a consent. So even if I don't know, a developer like Todd Property goes and gets 100 apartments consented, it doesn't mean that they're going to build them, because then they turn around and say, well, what's it going to cost? Oh, gosh, building costs are ridiculously high. I think we might pause. So a building consent does not mean a built house. That's really important. So when you hear building consents are rising, dig down and find out how has that translated into new stock. So construction costs just go up and up and up. There was an article recently that said US construction costs are about 40% cheaper, in Australia are about 30% cheaper. We've got a few monopolies or duopolies here. That means that there's not a lot of competition. It's just ridiculously expensive. Lisa's got a little bit of insight into that maybe some sectors some price bands are getting cheaper. Lisa, do you have any comments on that?
Just really, I think it's important to look at the escalation of our costs, roughly around 7, close to 8% per annum in terms of construction costs. So we look at sort of the inflation of that relative to other things. It's considerable, and that is having that, along with labour availability, is having a considerable impact in what goes from the consent phase to being built. What we've got is we do have some sort of pockets in the market that are being built that are being well attended to in terms of the lower end of the market. We've got Kiwi builds, we've got the government trying to contribute to that. Those of you who are Kiwis, and particularly those of you who are onshore, will appreciate that the whole Kiwi build thing is a bit of a shambles, and targets, we know we're close to meeting targets, but nevertheless the government is looking to support that end of the market. Then we've got the higher end of the market, over the $1 million plus, I'm talking just residential here, is also being well looked after because the margins there for construction are good. What we've got in the 700 to sort of 1.1, 1.2, that market is not being well catered for. So it's good to kind of just have a little bit of insight into the slice and dice of that, because we are going to have supply constraint, particularly in that sort of price point. That's not just in Auckland, that is across the country, and that's probably, if it something that will just continue to escalate if we don't get some change to either the cost structure, and of course we've also got labour there as well, which is not confined to that point in the market, mostly construction costs and margins for developers in that sort of 700 to 1.1 space.
Thanks. Okay, let's keep going now. And just on that poll, well, foreign ownership banning impact, most people are saying no. So some are unsure, most people saying no. Regions, steady, yes and no. Yeah, they're steady, but steady is in the sense that we've seen a lot of overflow and from Auckland. So Auckland demand has spilled over to Hamilton, and we've also seen that in Hastings and Napier. Wellington, not so much. Christchurch, Queenstown, absolutely. Wanaka, Cromwell. There's some areas that have definitely experienced a bit of a surge. And I think historically, if we went back 10 years, we said don't touch the regions because they just don't have a strong enough economic story. And we're now getting some confidence around some of those regions because people are seeing that some businesses are saying, well, we can let people operate from a branch down there. So there might be software developers that are, an article recently that where a software development firm took a poll from its employees and they said we'd like to have the option to have an office in Hastings or Napier, and they've done that. So there is that kind of remote working ability. So that's we're starting to see that starting to happen. Regional growth, it's just really interesting how, and this supports it. So Auckland at the moment slid sideways, but then we've seen other cities really grow, and our sense though is that that's going to start to taper off. So the demand and drivers that have impacted demand in Auckland are probably going to start to hit those regions. Auckland rental market, not much happening now, but we have seen growth. But I think if supply continues to be constrained, we'll start to see that grow again. So that's demand and supply, and the overall picture, the overall story for demand and supply is that we see demand being far greater than supply. It's just that some of that demand, or a lot of that demand at the moment, can't express itself. So that's why the market is stalled, it's stagnant. We don't think the Auckland market's going to go backwards significantly because the fundamentals are really strong. And Lisa, just your quick comment on that foundation. Do you concur that the foundation is strong, or what's your view?
Yeah, I do, and I think that what it always come back to is just an assessment of those fundamentals. So I'm talking to clients every week that are looking to invest in. What I say is that we need to have a long-term story to look at. We need to have a long-term story for New Zealand, and we also need to have a long-term story for the location that we're looking to invest in. So the first thing is we need to look at the economy and say, what's the economy doing? Our economy is really really sound. We've got a strong labour market. The housing market is still sound, so yes, it's a little bit quieter than it has been. Consumer confidence is, while not at all-time high, high, it is still solid, and we've got low unemployment, and our economic forecast in terms of growth is good. So that's the first thing that we need to understand is where is the country at, and then we need to sort of put ourselves through all those filters that Alan has sort of gone through. And the sum up of that is that the fundamentals in the market are sound, and when we look at what is taking the activity out of the market, it's really important that we actually look at what that is. So for New Zealand recently, the banking changes have made a significant impact. And also when we have a look at the Australian market, that is obviously getting a lot of media attention, and that again is a result of some big changes around banking. So really important that when we look at stats, look at softening of markets, that we really understand what it is, because that will help us to assess whether it's short-term, long-term, just or blip on the radar. So yes, I do think that the fundamentals are really sound, and I guess just to add to the regional Auckland conversation, we have got some growth that's coming through. So when we have a look at sales growth over the last 3 months, we look at that year on year, we do have growth. Now, to be fair, that growth is weighted towards the regions, and Auckland is just slightly below. What we are seeing is that growth in the regions is starting to taper off and slow down, and I think that's important when we have a look at sort of cyclical activity. So Auckland's been going through about a 4-year sort of rapid growth phase since sort of 2014. It's really started to spike, and then the Auckland sort of started to quieten down, and the regions have taken off. Now the regions are starting to do their own tapering, which then sort of brings us back to that long-term story for Auckland, because people, what people do say is, well, at the moment the Auckland market is really quiet, it's not growing. What do we say about Auckland? I think we've just got to remember that the greater population growth is in Auckland, our greater economic growth, the land and bureaucratic constraints create demand. Auckland is holding on to the young people when the regions can't. We're attracting the foreign buyers in Auckland. So there's a whole lot of things there that are adding to the story for Auckland. So for those of you that are listening, that are sort of looking at the stats and going, look, maybe the regions are a better place to go, again, just take a pause and sort of try and get that in perspective. I still think that while there are some regions that are developing long-term, have got some great long-term stories, that's not going to apply to all. For those of you who are wondering about Auckland, no need to panic.
Thanks, Lisa. And just before we jump into Auckland, which will be pretty quick because I'm conscious that we've only got a quarter of an hour to go, I think Toby's got another question.
Yeah, so there's a question that's come in on the Q&A. So proportionally, it seems that there was a lot of construction work in Queenstown with the increased supply. With this on top of foreign ownership ban, what impact do you think this will have on the medium-term property prices in the area? Do you also expect there to be a short-term dip in prices, as there must be a drop in demand given the mix of factors in play?
Thanks. Just keep in mind what is demand relative to supply at the moment. Huge amount of demand. People are struggling to get rentals all the time. We hear about businesses where they'll offer a job to people for Queenstown, and then they try and find a house to live and they can't, and they decline the job offer. So from a residential long-term housing perspective, not a big deal. The tourism sector, no, it's not foreign buy ownership. Look, the money, it doesn't stop people buying. It's only residential property, so no restriction on farms. But then they've got to go through the OIO, and people with enough money are going to be able to buy anyway. So it doesn't impact commercial property at all, and so not seeing it as a big deal. Tourism, I think the bigger thing to worry about there would be Jacinda and Huawei and China getting upset with us, and that's a bigger concern if that was to hang around long term. But that's like, is that going to really happen long term? If Jacinda lets that become terminal, she'll be out. Surely she'll be out of office quicker than a rat up a drain pipe, and then National come in and reverse that and try and amend. I don't know, but anyway, okay. Let's keep going. We're on the countdown to the hour, so there'll be some Hong Kong people wanting to get busy with work. Auckland is significant. We need to understand it because it impacts the rest of the country. This is a study done by Harrison Grierson back in 2011. Black line represents the metropolitan urban limit of Auckland. White means there's no capacity left to build. That's 2011, and they forecast out to 2021 and said that there's going to be a lot of suburbs that get completely built out. In 2031, there'll be no ability to create any more housing, and that's why they introduced the unitary plan that allows for greater intensification. This plan also said, research also said by 2023 you won't be able to build any more standalone housing. When I first put the slide up in 2011, people threw sausage rolls at me and told me I was a lunatic. But then we're starting to see that come to fruition. We've done the unitary plan, but it's not going to solve the problem, because just because you technically can build, it doesn't mean people will, because of construction costs and Resource Management Act and publicly notified consents restricting people. And it's just, there's so many things that can restrict you actually building on a site, or just an investor that doesn't want to build because they just want to hang on and experience capital growth because they don't want to become a developer. So we have this rule book for all. It's 70% up and 30% out, and that will help ease some supply constraints, but it's not going to happen quickly in our opinion. And just remember, we haven't touched on it, but developer finance has just become hard to get because we've lost that mezz finance industry during the GFC, and then banks at the moment, property developers are evil Knievel's that shouldn't be talked to in general, and it's just so hard to get money out of them for development. And then they make developers get 100% pre-sales to reduce their risk entirely, and by the time they've done that, over 18 months, prices have gone up again, so they've got to pull the development and start again. So it's just not an easy environment in New Zealand to solve the supply problem. We need new dwellings. I won't dwell on this. I won't get into this too deeply because we've got to keep moving, and we need new dwellings, but we're not meeting the requirement. New solutions are required. It's unaffordable, so let's do Kiwi Build and let's build 100,000 homes over 10 years and be aspirational, which is all well and good, but until you build houses that people don't want and employ CEOs that then take off, and it's just a shambles. And what do we do? Well, it'll be interesting to see what genie they pull out of the hat. I think there may have been some revised targets released today, but it's not working. And it's this is a government that says they can do all of this for the nation. And yes, we do need to address affordability of homes, and we need to provide homes for all. But my message is, well, actually, the government can't do it by themselves, and they need to make it attractive for the private industry, for the private sector to get involved. And there needs to be more than just saying that we'll buy some of your development. That's a massive topic. Massive barriers for developers that we've talked about, so we'll keep going on that one. What government is actually taking? They tried to do SHAs, that's been repealed. Rules Reduction Task Force, remember that's gone. I mean, the Resource Management Act to strip costs and delays, I just don't see great progress on that. Development contributions reviewed. No, that doesn't seem to be much happening there. Kiwi Build, no. Redevelop Crownland, not seeing much. So just real restrictions. I think there might be another question, Toby.
So we've spoken about Auckland and the shortage of supply there. What are your views on Wellington for investment for long term?
So I just want to preface what I'm about to say with the statement that I was born in Wellington, and I think it's an amazing place to visit. And there's some really great things about Wellington. And I'm sorry to this person that's answered the question if you already own property there, but you wouldn't get me to buy property in Wellington if you paid me. The reason being that the population's decreasing, the banks have left, the oils companies have left, it's windy, it's wet. I'm kidding about the last ones, don't kill me. But most importantly, I was talking to an insurance broker the other day. Insurance companies just won't insure properties down there. And you'd say, well, why are people only? Surely people have got insurance. They don't want to insure properties down there, and insurance premiums are ridiculously high. So I've just not seen a great economic story for it, which leads on to the question, which is probably a good question, because what I want to talk about is where would I buy for maximum capital growth, and look what how Auckland has performed relative to Wellington over the last couple of decades. So as an investor, I am primarily chasing capital growth while I'm trying to build wealth. And when I'm retired, I want yield. So I just want yield. I just want to get a nice clip of the ticket off of a beautiful commercial property, which we can buy for you. And Toby will happily talk to you about that. But so why would I invest in Wellington when I'm not going to see, history says I'm not going to see the capital growth down there? I'm not saying it won't experience capital growth. I'm just saying that I'm chasing maximum capital growth. So I'm chasing Auckland. Where am I chasing? Okay, let's get into that. So I'm into Auckland because it's where 2/3 of the population growth is going to be. So that equals demand. It's where the jobs are, the infrastructure are, and we've got a supply problem. Yeah, we want to see that supply problem fixed, because if we don't, it'll screw the whole nation, and then people won't want to come here at all. But at the moment, we've got a supply problem, which means we're unlikely to see supply exceed demand. So no, I buy in Wellington, and I've also got through. And now, where would I buy once I'm in a city? Cities expand in concentric circles from their point of origin, and so what we say is you want to be where the fish are. Fish are often first home buyers. That's where the biggest pool of fish are. So let's go to where they're buying. And what are they typically buying? They want to buy an affordable first home with a bit of land out the back. And that was once Westmere in Auckland. And then Westmere became unaffordable, and it became Grey Lynn, and then it became Waterview, and then that became unaffordable, and it became Avondale, and then it became Glen Eden. So we're really, really focused on saying where are those first home buyers in general going to go. And then once we decide the ring of suburbs that it's going to be in, it's not every suburb, because take three things. It's got to have accessibility to jobs, so train stations, motorway on-ramps. Secondly, culture. Well, stick in that community. So why do we like Glen Eden? You probably don't know where Glen Eden is, because it has a train station. When we first started buying there, it's got a little village, and that's got really cool now. It's got a barber, and so it's got a library, it's got a theatre, and then you've got to get the street right as well. And that's what we spend a lot of our time doing. So yep, anybody can go and buy a property. Sure, you can stroll out, look up trade, make an offer, pay too much, don't do your due diligence, buy a dog, buy in the wrong area that never goes up. Yep, anybody can buy a property, but it's really easy to get it badly. Do it badly. Do it well. Identify you. We'll get onto that. So yeah, demand flows outwards. Buy where people are going to go to, and buy something that's likable. So get the right street, the right amount of land, and the right dwelling, the right configuration. I think long. What am I going to do? I'm going to think long term. Would I lock in long term fixed rates? I'm looking at it. I'm watching. Do I want to do that? Buying good places where you're going to get growth. Auckland, Hamilton, Queenstown, Tauranga, maybe Hastings, Napier if you can't afford Hamilton. And as much land as you can get. Last section, I'm going to give you an example of, we've got 5 minutes. Last section, how to make money out of property. Hey, take it easy. Long-term view, leverage sensibly, get a plan, great property, and take action. Lots of people come and see me and see us and say, hey, what should I do? Should I buy? Should I wait? When should I buy? Just buy, get on with it. Yep, I'm going to say, because that's my business. Considered approach. I'm not saying I'm not considered. She's a fan of buying right now because of the opportunities. Get the plan. Here's a plan of a client, 200K gross passive income by 2035. We mapped out, this is our own software that we use, 2 properties in 2015. You can see the purchase prices and the proposed deposits. What did this will do? What's happened? So they have brought, this is what we brought for them. I'm not saying it's what we'd buy today, but it's just an example of what we've done as a property buyer on their behalf. He's experienced across all these properties. You can see we've bought in a range of areas. We've also bought a new build for them that's worked. And they've now got some great equity of about 2.8 million. So how does that stand against their goals? Well, by 2016, we forecast that have 1.6 mil of equity using a 5% capital growth rate. and they've achieved 2.4 million, and now a bit more by 2018, 2.8. Hey, so they're killing their goals, and they're well on their way to their 6 mil equity target. So I'm gonna whiz through to the end here because we've run out of time. This presentation will be available, and you can go back through it as well, the video presentation. So all of this will be available. So look, I'm going to hand back to Toby, who's going to close out and beneficial for those who've been listening in, and look forward to hearing about you. If you've got property questions, just put them forward to Toby. Thanks very much, Toby.
Thanks, Alan. I guess really just one last question, which is I think we all know what the answer is going to be, but most media reports that New Zealand might be fairly flat to down this year. In actual fact, there was a latest ASB report out this morning saying exactly that, saying that the Auckland market specifically is off slightly. Do you see this as a good opportunity to buy? Do you want to wait? Do you suggest waiting for a few months, see what happens?
Absolutely a great time to buy. We are buying for what we believe is an inevitable uplift in values. Absolutely. How long is it going to be flat for? Could be 12 months, 18 months, 24 months. But I absolutely fundamentally believe that at some point this market is going to pop. And I use the word pop because I think what is happening is that it's all these I guess gaseous elements that I kind of used as the analogy are restricting the market, hard to get finance, but people want to buy. We need homes. I keep coming back to the fact that we need houses. The longer that this flat period goes on, the sharper the upswing I believe will be when the market finally turns, which is probably when credit becomes easy to get hold of. So I'm a buyer because I want to personally and because I do it professionally. So I'm a buyer, and I just cannot see how all prices, Hamilton prices, Queenstown prices are going to tumble. And I absolutely believe that prices in the medium to long term are going to rocket. Thanks, Toby.
Alan and myself obviously are here in Auckland. For those of you that would like to be in touch, and we'll be visiting Hong Kong and Singapore in the coming weeks. So for anyone in those centres keen to meet up, please be in touch. There will be a recording of this made available as well, so please feel free to share. Lastly, thanks to Sam Jeffries for organising, and also Pablo Riquelme for the research. Thanks very much.